Thank you, Mrs. Walker. We appreciate that ministry of music here tonight. It was back several years ago while attending a National Religious Broadcasters Convention. I saw a fellow running around very rapidly. He had a big satchel and papers flowing out, and it was really thick because he had lots of thick books inside. And introduced himself as Bill Federer, and he is the compiler of America's God and Country, Encyclopedia of Quotations. And he was saying, the information was just flowing from him. Did you know this about George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and did you know this Constitution, this state? And on he was going. I said, thanks for the book. Well, we took the book back, and as we looked through this, we thought, wow, this is really a masterpiece of things that have been put together. And so we introduced Bill to our crosstalk audience, invited him to come on, and many people found great value in the work that he has compiled, the many, many hours of research that has gone into the works that he's involved in. I know also then he put more effort into putting it onto a CD-ROM along with many other resources, and then he's branched out. He's worked with groups like Matt Staver at Liberty Counsel to research matters pertaining to the Ten Commandments and to look at the influence of the Ten Commandments upon our nation's founding and how they have been interwoven throughout the very founding of our nation. And even to this day, whenever I call up Bill for just a brief moment, the information just continues to flow outside of him, and before we hang up, he tells me something new that he's learned pertaining to either our founders or something great in history. Well, we also learned that Bill was putting out a brand new book, and it was dealing with George Washington Carver. And as we saw that, we said, wouldn't it be great to have him come and do a special emphasis here in Black History Month, dealing with Black Americans who've influenced our nation toward God, toward Christ, and toward biblical values. And we invited him up, and he's put together a presentation just specifically for this occasion. No doubt he'll be able to use it now in other places as well. And he's going to be highlighting several Black Americans and highlighting George Washington Carver in particular. But we appreciate the work that you've done, Bill, in putting together all the many hours of research and your dedication. Bill is also one who doesn't just, write about these things. This man has run for Congress against Dick Gephardt in the 2000 election. And there was a lot of shenanigans that went on in that race. But I know he's really seeking the Lord's will, even about what the Lord would have him do in the future. But we count it a privilege to have him as our friend and to have him here at the Waukesha Expo. Let's welcome Bill Federer here tonight for the special rally presentation.
I think I'm on. Well, it's great to be here. Jim, thank you so much for that introduction. And first of all, I would like to say how much I respect Vic Eliason and VCY America and the tremendous work that they are doing, not just here in Milwaukee, but across America. And you get the blessing of being right here. So God bless you, Vic, and all of the VCY America family. Well, I have to say that it was such a tremendous inspiration for me to study the great Black men and women throughout our history and how they impacted. And I knew a lot already before I started studying, but to tell the truth, I was touched in my heart. And when I read the stories of Black men and women and the trials that they went through and the horrors of slavery, it brought tears to my eyes. And I think that God wants to do a healing in our nation, and it first has to start with knowledge. We have to know the truth. We have to know the past. And believe me, the stories are so inspirational. They cross all racial barriers, and Jesus Christ is exalted through them. Well, I have a computer here that I may need a little help to get this all up and running, and it has the pictures of some of the great people that influenced our country. And if somebody knows a little bit more about this, I have it on my screen here, but oh, there you go. Okay. Wow. I wrote a book on George Washington Carver. I'm going to give a little introduction, then I'm going to talk about some other people, and then I'm going to come back to him. My mom grew up in Neosho, Missouri, which is 8 miles away from Diamond Grove, Missouri, where George Washington Carver was raised. In 1855, my great-great-grandfather, whose name was George Washington Epperson, moved from Tennessee to Marion County, Illinois, to McDonald County in Missouri, which is where Neosho and Diamond Grove was. And so we have roots there. Ever since I was a boy growing up, we would go to the George Washington Carver Memorial. And we would tour and walk the little trail through the woods and see the old place where the cabin was, where they built the replica. And it'd just be touched in our heart. It just became part of my childhood. And the first book that my grandparents ever gave me was a book on George Washington Carver. And I remember reading through it. It had the big letters, so it was, easy for me to read. And I remember being touched, and he even brought to tears when he would go through the different trials. And it was, years later that I realized that there was a difference in colors. And it's like, when somebody's in your heart, it doesn't matter. And I think that I'm forever thankful to my grandparents who have gone on to be with the Lord for giving me that book. And I wrote this book by going down to Tuskegee and going to Diamond Grove, Missouri, and reading through the letters that Carver wrote throughout his life. You always see stuff where here's a great African-American scientist, he did great things with the peanut, now let's move on to somebody else. Well, I wanted to dwell on him a little bit and read through his memoirs and read through his personal correspondence, and it is absolutely tremendous. And so we're going to get into that in a little bit. But I wanted to start off with some other great people, and this is Dr. Ben Carson. Now, Dr. Ben Carson is the head of neurological surgery at Johns Hopkins University. This is one of the most prestigious positions in the entire medical field. And he started off in Detroit, grew up. His mother was one of 24 children, and she was married when she was 13 and had 2 children, and later found out that the husband had another wife across town, and so she divorced him. And so she had their 2 children that she was raising on her own. And she would work all kinds of hours and not have time, and they'd end up watching television, and they would get into trouble. And so Ben had a terrible temper and would go to school and didn't know any of the answers. And by 5th grade, he had the reputation of being a dummy. And the students one time had an argument, and he got into a fight because they were trying to decide if he was the dumbest kid in the class or the dumbest kid in the world. Isn't that terrible? So his mom, Sonia, decided that no more TV. And so when they would come home from school, she would walk them the 7 blocks to the public library, and she would have them read books and write a book report for her. And at first, Ben thought this was child abuse. And finally, he started liking it. And one of the corners were turned when he was in class one day, and the teacher held up a rock and said, "Does anybody know what kind of rock this is?" And nobody knew. And he looked at it and he said, "It's obsidian." And all the other kids in the class looked at him, and he wasn't called dummy after that anymore. And he began to do book reports for his mom. Now, years later, he realized that his mom couldn't even read. And she was having him do this, and they'd hand him the book reports, and she'd look at it, but she couldn't even read it. Now, she since has gone on, and she's got her college degree. But this is the background that he was in. Now, the Lord was somebody that was very important in his life. He said several things. When studies overwhelmed Ben and his brother, Sonia, the mother, would say, "You weren't born to be a failure. You can do it. You just ask the Lord and He will help you." At age 8, Ben had heard a missionary speak at church, and Ben made up his mind that he wanted to be a missionary doctor. His mother's reaction was, "Well, Benny, you will be a doctor." Becoming a doctor would demand a fine education, which Sonia didn't find in the local schools. It didn't matter if the children weren't made to learn their multiplication tables in schools. She made them learn them at home. And then she would have them walk to the library. And 2 things were working in his favor. One was his strong faith in God that continued to sustain him, and the other was the mother who got involved in his life and believed in him, a mother who prayed for wisdom to go beyond her own 3rd grade education in order to instill in her son the enthusiasm for learning. Her prayers led her to a plan that worked. Well, he went on to go to high school. He eventually earned a scholarship to Yale University, went on to medical school at the University of Michigan. By age 33, he had earned his current position as Director of Pediatric Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins University. And ladies and gentlemen, he is the youngest man ever to hold this position. Extremely distinguished title. He performs over 500 critical operations on children in dire need each year, which is over triple the normal neurosurgeon. And in 1987, Dr. Carson did a brand new world-shaking surgery by separating two Siamese twins, the Binder twins, who were joined at the head, at the skull. And they shared a vein that was a vital vein for bringing blood out of the brain. And both of the Siamese twins had that same vein. And all the doctors were saying, well, one of these is going to have to die. Well, he spent 5 months planning the surgery. It was a 22-hour surgery, and guess what? Both of them survived. And it made world news. Tremendous impact. And this is what he said. When asked how he stayed focused, he said, "It's a matter of constantly being in the correct state of mind. The first thing I do is pray. Then I read from the Bible, the book of Proverbs, which has an enormous amount of wisdom. Just give me wisdom to know what to do and what not to do," states the humble physician. Dr. Carson shares his wisdom in several outstanding books. One is Gifted Hands, and another is Think Big. And he's the recipient of 21 honorary doctorates. 21 honorary doctorates. And he's been written up in Parade Magazine, Reader's Digest, New York Times, Fortune Magazine, and he's right there in Baltimore, Maryland. And his book, Think Big, the title of it, the Think stands for T, talent, H, honesty, I, insight, N, nice, K, knowledgeable, B, books, I, in-depth learning, and G, God. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a tremendous American, a tremendous human being, and an inspiration to each and every one of us. And I want to thank God for Dr. Ben Carson. Now, another one of my heroes is Dr. Alan Keyes. And Dr. Alan Keyes was the ambassador to the UN for President Ronald Reagan. He spent 11 years in the U.S. State Department, and we have Colin Powell that's in there right now, and Condoleezza Rice, great African-American leaders. But Alan Keyes served in the U.S. Foreign Service and was the staff at the National Security Council before becoming Ronald Reagan's ambassador to the UN, Economic and Social Council. He represented the interests of the United States in the UN General Assembly from 1983 to 1985. And in 1985, he was appointed Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations. He was the head of Citizens Against Government Waste, and he was the founder of National Taxpayers Action Day. He was the two-time Republican nominee for the United States Senate in the state of Maryland, and he was the Republican presidential candidate. Now, I was honored because I got, in my speaking across the country, people would organize events, and they would have me speak, and they would have Alan Keyes speak. And I had the opportunity of introducing him several times. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to speak before Alan Keyes speaks, but I will never speak after he speaks. Because he is the most powerful, captivating speaker since Frederick Douglass. And after he's done, the room gets quiet and everybody is so convicted, and you feel the presence of the Holy Spirit. And Dr. Alan Keyes got his doctorate from Harvard. He wrote his dissertation on constitutional theory. He is the intern president of Alabama A&M University in 1991. He speaks French and Spanish and a little Russian and a little ancient Greek, and is the author of Masters of the Dream, The Strength and Betrayal of Black America, 1995, and Our Character, Our Future, Reclaiming America's Moral Destiny. And he's unashamedly and consistently raises the standard of unalienable rights and biblical truth in defense of the unborn and for civil rights. You know, one of the things I love about Dr. Alan Keyes is he has taken the Declaration apart and studied it backwards and forwards. And the points in there is all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. All men, no matter which race, no matter which country, all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that declaration goes on to mention God several more times. It talks about laws of nature and of nature's God. It says, relying on the protection of divine providence. And with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence and the supreme ruler. And it refers to God 4 times. And here we are in a country where they're wanting to take God out of everything. And, you know, I debated the head of the Council for Secular Humanism in Newark, New Jersey last year, and he was trying to say our Constitution was a godless document because it did not invoke a deity. And I said, well, you know, it does say done in the year of our Lord, 1787, and it does honor the Christian Sabbath. But more importantly, it's based on this principle that John F. Kennedy brought out. John F. Kennedy said the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. And so Dr. Alan Keyes started a Declaration Foundation. And again, I had the honor of being with him in several different events around the country. And again, the most inspiring, godly Christian man who not only stands up for race, for equality, but stands up for God and the unborn, which takes a tremendous amount of courage. Another leader is Clarence Thomas. Now, I want to read to you an article written by Paul Weyrich, who's the head of Free Congress Foundation. And Paul Weyrich writes this: Clarence Thomas is slowly but surely becoming one of the most influential of the 9 jurists on the U.S. Supreme Court, whose opinions today have so much to do with the conduct of our government as well as our daily lives. No Supreme Court justice in history has had to endure the constant vilification which Thomas has. He has chosen to ignore what was said about him in favor of long hours and hard work on cases assigned to him. He told me, and this is to Paul Weyrich, that his greatest satisfaction in being on the Supreme Court is the ability to eventually bring his colleagues around to a sound point of view by doing solid work. Every issue, ever since he was confirmed in 1991, 52 to 48, Clarence Thomas has been determined to outlive his critics, not just by serving longer on the court, but by becoming, through solid historical work, a respected force. Nothing has shaken him from this goal. And I thought this last part here that I'm going to read is very interesting. He says, some justices have their clerks do all the writing. They merely outline their views, and the clerks do the rest of the work. In fact, sometimes justices haven't even known which way they wanted to go on a case. So they had their clerks prepare both sides of an opinion of an issue, and then they choose the one that they want. Clarence Thomas, on the other hand, doesn't let others do for him the most important work of the court. He labors personally at writing the material himself. What has become clear is that as a result of his labors, the other justices now regard him as a keen intellect whose opinions have always backed by excellent research. Even when they disagree with Thomas, they know that he can back up his opinions with solid research. Now it is his critics who have begun to look foolish, as Thomas is emerging as a powerful voice on the court. His writings are stated so clearly that any citizen can understand them. His logic is powerful, his research impeccable. Now his influence with his colleagues is steadily increasing. Thomas is a model for anyone who has endured false criticism and demands the same sort of crowd in which, in Christ's time, shouted, "Give us Barabbas." Even among those he considers close friends, Thomas never lets his critics frame how he looks on things. He knows God, and he lets God determine the framework for his overall thinking. Beyond that, Thomas sticks to the Constitution, the minds of those who framed it, and as he labors through the myriad of issues which those who wrote the Constitution could ever have imagined. He has every right to be bitter, but he is anything but bitter. The reason his critics get more angry is because it is beginning to dawn on them that they have no effect on Thomas. Let those who have to face viciousness in unfair attacks look to the example of Clarence Thomas. He has taught us that even in a demented society, steady, solid, hard work will eventually win recognition and respect. And that's Supreme Court Justice, an African American, Clarence Thomas. Another one of my heroes is J.C. Watts. And I was just with him this past week and actually did a radio show with him. We talked about George Washington Carver. And he said, you know, Bill, I got a chance to meet one of the Carver boys. See, George Washington Carver disciples students. And there was a group of them that he spent some extra time with. And J.C. Watts said, yeah, I went to visit Mr. Grisham in Bethany, Oklahoma. He's 91 years old now. And I got a chance to go over to his house and just to listen to him talk about Dr. Carver and what a great Christian man he was. But J.C. Watts was the University of Oklahoma star quarterback football player, and he led his team to 2 Orange Bowl victories and was named the Orange Bowl Most Valuable Player. And then he went to play professional football with the Canadian League and was named the most valuable player up there. Then he came back to Oklahoma and worked with his dad, who was a pastor, and he became a youth minister, an ordained Christian minister, and very effective. And then he decides to run for Congress. And in 1994, he gets elected to the United States Congress in a district that's 80% white. He is so respected in Congress that he gets voted the House Conference Chairman, which is, ladies and gentlemen, the 4th most important position in our government. The House Conference Chairman is the one that, in the case of the Republicans, all the Republican congressmen meet on a side room of the Capitol before they go out onto the main floor. And they discuss what they're going to do and what their game plan is. J.C. Watts chaired the committee. He's the one that stood there and called, okay, you get to speak now, and you get to speak now, and you don't get to, and twice I was in that meeting, and J.C. Watts called me up to the front and gave me the microphone, and I got to speak to all the congressmen, Dennis Hastert, Dick Armey, Tom DeLay, Tom Davis, and he allowed me to be able to address the leadership of our country. J.C. Watts he came to St. Louis when I was running for office, as Jim mentioned, and spoke for me. And just a great leader. And ladies and gentlemen, I think he just decided, he said, Bill, when I ran for Congress, I said that I was going to run for 3 terms. He said, I ran 4. And he says, I want to spend time with my family. He says, my son's got his basketball season now, and I got to drive him to the basketball games. And so he's back in Oklahoma, and he just wrote a book. And the title of the book is, What Color is a Conservative? Brilliant book from a brilliant man. And I think it's important that we as Americans and all Americans realize the contribution of men like J.C. Watts, Alan Keyes, Clarence Thomas, and all the great leaders, Dr. Ben Carson. And I want to give J.C. a hand. And he's such a strong Christian. Now, how many of you have been down to Tuskegee? Well, if you ever go down there, they have the museum where they have Dr. Carver's, George Washington Carver's, all of his microscopes and all of his things and inventions and plants and samples of foods and so forth. But on the side, there's a little theater, and in the theater, you get to watch a movie, and it's the movie of the Tuskegee Airmen. It's a very inspiring story of these pilots, African-American pilots, and the struggles they went through to become pilots, and then in the war, working through a military system that wasn't going to put them in a place where they could fight, but they were all trained for it, and then finally they got the open door, and they got to go over to North Africa, and then they got to fly in Europe, and they got a reputation of being the best, of flying and being trustworthy. And when the big bombers that were slow had to have planes accompany and defend them, The Tuskegee Airmen were the ones that were requested to be the ones protecting the convoy of those airplanes. Harriett Tubman. Now, I felt it's important that we look at great African American women as well. Harriett Tubman was born in 1819 or 1820. We don't know because she was born a slave and they didn't keep the records. And she was in Dorchester County, Maryland. And when she was 12 years old, she was seriously injured by a blow to the head from an overseer because she refused to tie up another slave who had attempted to escape. You know, there were terrible injustices that were done, and it breaks my heart to see to read these stories of the injustices that were done. Well, she was given a piece of paper by a white neighbor with 2 names on it, and told how to find the house that she could escape to. And she went to that house. At the first house, she was put into a wagon covered with a sack and driven to her next destination. Following this route to Pennsylvania, she initially settled in Philadelphia, where she met William Still, a Philadelphia station manager on the Underground Railroad. With his assistance, they formed the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society and began working with the Underground Railroad. In 1851, she began relocating members of her family to Ontario, Canada, and then in the operations until 1857. After freeing herself from slavery, Harriett Tubman had the courage to go back into Maryland and into America and to rescue members of her family, and she eventually conducted over 300 people to freedom. 300 people to freedom, and she risked her life because they had the Democrats had just passed the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, and it was if you are caught harboring a slave, then you are punished, and so they wanted to turn people in. So she was risking her life, and the story says that she was pretty tough, and she knew that if she was helping somebody to escape, and they got afraid and went back, that they could get forced to tell where the Underground Railroad was, and they'd all get in trouble. And so she told them, she says, if you're going to come with me, you have to be willing to not turn back or die. And she told them, she said, if we get halfway there and you decide to turn back, she let them know pretty strong that she might be the one to shoot him, you know. So thank God for women with some backbone, too. A great leader. And she had a U.S. postage stamp made with her image on it. These are inspiring stories. They happened right here in America. Another one is Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was born a slave, and she was able to get free, and when she did, she prayed and went to the Lord and asked the Lord. She said, I didn't want to have any of Egypt on me. And so not only did I leave all the trappings of Egypt behind, but I left my name behind. This is what she said. When I left the house of bondage, I left everything behind. I wanted to keep nothing of Egypt on me, so I went to the Lord and asked him to give me a new name. I set up under a banner, and then I sing. And I tell the folks that come around to listen, and then I tell them about Jesus. She was a Christian woman that went around from upstate New York to, she was born in 1797. She had 4 masters until the 4th of July, 1827, when slavery was finally abolished in the state of New York. It was 1827 that New York ended slavery. Then she took the courageous court action of demanding the return of her youngest son, Peter, who had been illegally sold away from her to a slave owner in Alabama. And she moved to New York City. She was able to get her son back. She was deeply religious. And I love it because every biography you read on Sojourner Truth, she was so sold out to the Lord that even histories that are written that don't like to talk about religion, they have to mention religion because she was so touched and so open about it. She became a traveling preacher, and she all the way from Long Island to Connecticut, speaking to people on the countryside about her life and her relationship with God. She was a powerful speaker and a powerful singer. When she rose to speak, wrote one observer, her commanding figure and dignified manner hushed every trifler in the audience to silence. Audiences were melted into tears by her touching stories. After several months of traveling, Truth was encouraged by friends to go to Northampton Association, which had been founded in 1841 as a cooperative community dedicated to abolitionism. And there she met one of the thinkers, William Lloyd Garrison. And just last week, I met a descendant of William Lloyd Garrison and was able to give him a copy of my book on George Washington Carver. Sojourner Truth met President Lincoln in the White House. And President Lincoln told her that he had heard her speeches long before. So here was a woman who made an impact on the President of the United States. And thank God for a woman filled with the Holy Ghost and being willing to stand up for truth and to risk her life to help free her brothers and sisters from slavery. Another one I want to talk about is Richard Allen. But before I do that, a little bit of history. In 1619, the first Dutch ship carrying slaves came up the James River in Virginia. 1619. Well, in Massachusetts, a slave trading ship tried to come up, and the Puritans and the Pilgrims were so upset at this, they took the captain of the slave ship and threw him in jail and arrested him. And they took the ship and they returned all the slaves back to Africa. And you begin to see that there's two different threads that run throughout the history of our country. On the one side of abolition, in 1732, Oglethorpe, that founded Georgia, in his original writings, he forbade slavery. In 1774, two of the colonies rejected slavery. And then you see some interesting writings because some of the other colonies wrote laws to abolish slavery, but King George III vetoed them. King George III, they wanted to get rid of slavery, and King George III vetoed them. And that was one of the things that colonists were upset about that caused them to want to have the revolution against King George III. You see that there's underlying currents going on here. So the two colonies already backed away. When Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, the first draft got rid of slavery. It condemns King George III for 19 different things. He takes taxation without representation. He incites the natives of the frontiers to attack us. And he imprisons people who have never offended him from a distant land and forces them to serve in slavery, and he impedes every single chance to try to free them. And that's listed by Thomas Jefferson as one of the reasons that we're rebelling against Britain. Well, guess what? A couple of the southern states said, we're not going to sign the Declaration as long as that's in there. And you and I wish that they would have had enough guts to stand their ground, but unfortunately, as much courage as they had, they didn't, and they backed away, and they went ahead and let those states erase that line out of the Declaration, and they came up with the Declaration we have now, which didn't eliminate slavery. Well, two of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Rush, who helped start the American Bible Society, he helps found the first anti-slavery society. And guess who was the first president of the first anti-slavery society? Benjamin Franklin. Good old Ben Franklin. I mean, after he signed the Declaration, after he signed the Constitution, he dedicated the rest of his life to fighting slavery. Another one was Henry Lee. Noah Webster fought slavery, the guy that wrote Webster's Dictionary. And also Livingston, who signed the Constitution. wanted to get rid of slavery. Then in 1783, they voted to eliminate slavery from America, and it fell short by one vote. Isn't that terrible? One vote, they fell short. Well, in 1796, the different colonies had drawn their lines, but there was this territory out to the west. So George Washington signed a law forbidding slavery in all the free territories in 1796. And George Washington wrote in his will that all of his slaves were freed upon the death of his wife. Now, we wish he would have freed them right then, and several did free him right then, but he didn't have any kids to take care of his wife, and I guess he felt like he needed to do that. But he did free one of his slaves right then, who was he says, my mulatto man William, who was faithfully with me all his life and whose leg got injured in something, and he says that he's free, but he can stay here, and if he does stay here, we'll support him for the rest of his life. But that was George Washington. Then we start to see the lines develop. In the South, the Democrat Party passed through the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise said that, from now on, if new states want to come into the Union, we have to have a slave state come in the same time that a free state comes in. See, before then, when the guys that did the Declaration, they thought, well, slavery's on its way out. Pretty soon it's just going to sort of die out. But with that, and then the Fugitive Slave Law, then the Dred Scott case, then the Kansas-Nebraska Act, all of a sudden they realized that, wait a second, those slave states want to grow. And they want to have more and more slave states. And that is when things began to heat up. And you read the speeches of Abraham Lincoln when he debated Stephen Douglas, and you can see that Abraham Lincoln hated slavery. Some people say, well, he just declared the Emancipation Proclamation because of financial reasons or whatever. Well, you read Lincoln's views, he hated it. Even writing letters to Joshua Speed, a friend of his, he says, that trip we took down the Mississippi River and I saw those black men and women in chains on the steamboat going down to New Orleans, he says, that picture haunts my mind. And when he debated Stephen Douglas, Lincoln would get up there and condemn slavery, and Stephen Douglas would get up and he says, slavery is wrong, slavery is terrible, but it's a free country and everyone should have a free choice as to whether or not to own a slave. Isn't that terrible? Sounds like sort of a pro-choice argument we have today. Well, in 1856, back then there were two parties in America. There was the Democrat Party that was South and was pro-slavery, and there was the Whigs, W-H-I-G-S. And the Whigs wanted to be the big tent party, so they were sort of wishy-washy. They weren't for it, they weren't against it, they sort of wanted to hold the Union together, but people started getting fed up with the Whigs. And so in 1856, a new party was started, called the Republican Party. And the original platform of the Republican Party said, we want to eliminate the two relics of barbarism, polygamy and slavery. And every single plank of the Republican Party since has been to eliminate slavery. And indeed, when the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the South, some people question, well, is that really legal for the president to just sign a little bill and make a law? And so they passed the 13th Amendment. And out of all of the amendments, the 13th Amendment is the only one signed by a president. It's signed by Abraham Lincoln. It would have gone into law without his signature. He didn't have to sign it, but he signed it to show that he is so enthusiastic about freeing the slaves and prohibiting slavery in all the states. Of all the Republican congressmen and senators that voted, 100% of the Republicans voted for the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendments. Very few Democrats voted for it. And that's just history. That's just a historical record. You and I, no matter which color we are, we've inherited this country. What are we going to do with it? Well, I'll tell you what. It's always a story of one or two people with courage that are willing to stand up and make a difference. Isn't that the way the Bible is? I mean, God told Gideon, you got 30,000 men against 300,000, you got too many. Tell the ones that are afraid to go home. So it whittles down to 3,000 men, and God says, Gideon, that's still too many men. And again, he's like 3,000 against 300,000. It's still too many. He goes, yes. And so he said, tell him to go down by the creek and drink water. And those that bring it up to his mouth, keep. And those that put their head in the water, tell him to go home. Anyway, so it whittles down to 300. Little David against this 9-foot Goliath. Moses backed up against the Red Sea and Pharaoh charging in with these chariots going 30 miles an hour. God somehow seems to always wait till something looks hopeless, and he finds a couple men and women with courage against all odds that are willing to stand up and say, Lord, use me to make a difference. And I believe that these men and women that we're talking about throughout history are great African-American leaders in the past. They are inspirations to you and I today. To say, yes, there's problems in America and there's problems in the world, but they're overwhelming. No, they're not overwhelming. I'll just share something with you. If everything was perfect, and you lived your life and died and went to heaven, and you run into Moses and David and Sojourner Truth and Harriett Tubman and these great leaders up there, and you say, tell us the story again. What was it like, the Underground Railroad and risking your life? And what was it like, fighting Pharaoh? And they tell us these great, inspiring stories. And then they say, tell us, what did you do in your life? Tell us, and you want to say, well, everything was taken care of in my life. There wasn't anything to do. I mean, you're going to have to carry that story around forever where you go in heaven, No, but guess what? God gave us lots to do. So when you get to heaven and people walk up to you, and you're in the great assembly, and they call you up on the stage and say, it's your turn to tell what you did in your life, and everybody's looking right at you, you can say, yes, I was living in a time when there were problems, when there were still prejudices in different areas. And, we talk about slavery. There still is slavery going on in North Africa. There are missionary societies that are buying the Christian boys and girls that are enslaved by the northern Muslim tribes, and they're buying from the Muslims the Christians who have been enslaved. They're buying their freedom. It costs maybe about $3,000 to buy somebody. I talked to one organization that I heard that it was $175 they could buy the freedom for a little young girl. And what happens in Sudan today, the northern Muslim Sudanese have killed over 2 million Christians in southern Sudan. They have oil fields in the south, and in the north, the Sudanese have an oil company that's part owned by the Chinese, part owned by some of the Arabs, and they want to clear these people off this land so that they can drill for their oil. And so big is this that a friend of mine, Brad Phillips, has lobbied Congress for these last several years. And he got every one of the congressmen, 435, black and white, Democrat, Republican, to sign on to a bill to not do business with North Sudan until they stop punishing and killing the southern Sudanese Christians. And President Reagan signed it into law just a few months ago. Yes. President Bush, what did I say? It's these bright lights shining in my eyes. See, those are the listening on the radio. I'm up here with these bright lights, and it causes my brain to go on the blink. But President Bush signed it. And also, the problem with AIDS in Africa. That's a crisis that's looking for an answer. And you and I can make a difference in that. I'm going to go on and talk about a few others just because they're so interesting, and then I want to get to Carver, who's my favorite. The Buffalo Soldiers, the 9th and 10th Cavalry units. After the Civil War, African-American men volunteered and went out west. And they were soldiers in the different Indian wars and so forth, and they were excellent. And they got a reputation, but the Indians called them the Buffalo Soldiers. Why? Because the Indians respected the buffalo, and they were so strong and so determined and so hard to discourage. And then there's a man named Richard Allen. Richard Allen was born a slave. In 1777, he began going to a Methodist church. And the pastor there was Freeborn Garriston, who was an itinerant preacher. And so Richard Allen invited, and his master was a nice guy. You know, back then, there were 4 different levels of views towards slavery. You had the furthest north that said, slavery's wrong, get rid of it now. You had the middle north that said, slavery's wrong, let's just sort of ease out of it over a period of time. Then you had the middle south that said, slavery's wrong, but we got to live with it. It's been here for centuries. Then you got the Deep South that said slavery's right, let's keep it. And I don't know how they could justify it, but you read some of those writings, and they tried to. So they had all these confusing different views. Richard Allen's master was one of those ones that said, yeah, slavery's wrong, but we got to live with it. Anyway, Richard Allen invites this preacher over to the house to preach a sermon. And the preacher, thank God for anointed preachers like Joe Dollar, this preacher came in there and started preaching in the home, and Allen's master got converted. And the preacher preached on Judgment Day. And what would happen to the slaveholder? That the slaveholder would be weighed in the balance and found wanting. Well, so convicted was this that Richard Allen's owner went ahead and allowed him to get his freedom. So Richard Allen was there in the Civil War, Revolutionary War. He earned his living by sawing cordwood and driving a wagon during the Revolution. After the war, he furthered the Methodist cause by becoming a licensed exhorter, preaching to blacks and whites from New York to South Carolina. And his efforts attracted the attention of the Methodist leaders, including Francis Asbury. Now, Francis Asbury was the horseback Methodist preacher that rode over 300,000 miles on horseback. I mean, talk about saddle sore. Anyway, he was what they called a circuit riding preacher. Circuit meant to circle, and he would travel from Canada down to Florida and preach in all these different communities where they might not have a preacher come through but once a month. And then he got lots more of them and more of them and more of them. And so the Methodist Church went from just about 30 people to like 30,000 people because of his lifetime. Anyway, Francis Asbury encouraged Richard Allen and helped him to get a church started. And Francis Asbury went to and dedicated Richard Allen's church. And Richard Allen's church was started in 1792. By 1795, he had 121 members. 10 years later, he had 457 members. 10 years later, it was almost 1,300 members. And now the AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church, covers the world. It's all over. And then in 1816, he won legal recognition. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is a man who was anointed by God to make a difference. And in addition to that, he operated several businesses, and as a result, was able to serve the church without collecting a salary. These are examples that we need to follow. These are examples that are meant by the Lord to encourage us the same way that the Bible stories encourage us. Now, Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was born a slave in Virginia. When the Civil War ended, he and his family moved to West Virginia. He worked in a salt mine and in a coal mine, and he worked hard, and in his spare time would study. And then he walked, when he was 16 years old, he walked 500 miles to Hampton College, which was founded by General Armstrong, who was a Union general in the Revolutionary and Civil War. I'll get my wars straight here. General Armstrong started Hampton College for the freed black men and women. Booker T. Washington walks 500 miles, goes there, and gets his education. Afterwards, he teaches at several different places, and then he goes back to Hampton, and they give him a job. And he's such a great teacher that in 1881, he goes down to Alabama and forms the Tuskegee Institute. And by the time he died, it had over 3,000 students. His memoirs, Booker T. Washington's memoirs, are in the Library of Congress. I mean, they are considered national treasures. And let me just read a couple quotes. In the back of the book on George Washington Carver, I have an appendix of quotes from Booker T. Washington. This is what he wrote in his Up From Slavery book. He says, "If no other consideration had convinced me of the value of the Christian life, the Christ-like work which the churches of all denominations in America have done during the last 35 years for the elevation of the black man would have made me a Christian. In a large degree, it has been the pennies and the nickels and the dimes which come from Sunday schools and Christian Endeavor societies and missionary societies, as well as from the church proper, that have helped to elevate the Negro at a rapid rate." And this is another line. He says, talking about how he goes around and speaks all around the country. And he says, the next morning before day, I went carefully over what I planned to say at this big meeting in Atlanta where thousands showed up. He says, I also kneeled down and asked God's blessing upon my effort. Right here, perhaps I ought to add that I make it a rule never to go before an audience on any occasion without asking the blessing of God upon what I was to say. Then he goes on to write about Tuskegee. He says, Tuskegee is strictly undenominational, but thoroughly Christian. And the spiritual training of our students is not neglected. Our preaching service, prayer meetings, Sunday school, Christian Endeavor Societies, Young Men Christian Association, and various missionary organizations testify to this. He goes on to say, we have a department at Tuskegee known as the Phelps Hall Bible Training School, in which a number of students are preparing for the ministry or other forms of Christian work. And then he says this, with God's help, I believe that I have completely rid myself of any ill feeling toward the Southern white man for any wrong that he may have inflicted upon my race. You know, one of the things I've noticed about the men and women, whether it's Clarence Thomas, that could have a right to be bitter, but he's not, you know, whether it's the different people or Booker T. Washington, they could have a right to be bitter, that Jesus Christ is the only answer to the race problem. Jesus Christ is the only one that can bring healing. When Richard Allen's master got saved, that's when he was convicted of slavery. I tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, when people that are racist, whatever color they're, when they get saved, when they get Jesus Christ, that's when they get rid of any prejudice or bias. Am I doing okay? This is a statue at Tuskegee of Booker T. Washington, and it's a famous statue. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a former slave coming out from underneath the cloak, and Booker T. is lifting back the cloak and helping him out, and this is President Calvin Coolidge, who had visited Tuskegee, and a great inspiration. Booker T. Washington, he had courage to go to the highest people in the land and ask for support for his college. This is Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie Steel. This is President Taft. And listen to this quote from Booker T. Washington. He says, the more I come into contact with wealthy people, the more I believe that they are growing in the direction of looking upon their money as simply an instrument which God has placed in their hands for doing good. I never go to the office of Mr. John D. Rockefeller, who more than once has been generous to Tuskegee, without being reminded of this, the close, careful, and minute investigation that he always makes in order to be sure that every dollar that he gives will be used to the most good, an investigation that is just as searching as if he were investing money in a business enterprise, convinces me that the growth in this direction is most encouraging. Thank God for leaders like Booker T. Washington. And now to the main subject. Somebody that has impacted my life, George Washington Carver. With a statue there is a bronze statue of George as a young boy sitting on a rock in the country there on the grounds of the Carver Memorial in Diamond Grove, Missouri. And when he was born in 1865, slavery was just ending, and his dad had belonged to the next farm over, Mr. Grant's farm, and the dad died in a log hauling accident when they were carrying logs out of the woods, and he slipped and fell under the wheels. So he never met his dad. And when he was still an infant, there were bushwhackers going through southwestern Missouri. Jesse James, ever heard of Jesse James? Well, he was a Confederate soldier, and when the war was over, he liked the shooting and so forth. And well, there were groups of people that sort of took law into their own hands, and they would go around and they would go to farms, and especially if it was a Union sympathizing farm. And so they went to the Carver farm to try to rob them. And one of the things they did was they hung up Moses Carver. He was a German immigrant with his wife, Susan. They were childless. He hung him up by his thumbs. to try to torture him to get him to tell where the treasure was hidden. Well, they didn't have any treasure, and so the bushwhackers took Mary and little baby George and a sister, and they fled to North Arkansas. Well, they cut Moses Carver down, and he sends a friend out with his best horse to go chase after him, and the next day they catch him in northern Arkansas, and they say, look, just give us him back, and we'll give you this horse, and his best racehorse. And they say, well, tie the horse to the fence and leave, and we'll bring him back. So they tie the horse and leave. When they come back, there's no mom, there's no daughter. All there is, lying in a blanket, dying of whooping cough, is little baby George. He's as good as dead, thin, skinny. They pick him up and they bring him back to Moses and Susan. Moses and Susan raise him as their own. They don't have children. And they have George and his older brother Jim. Jim was healthy, and so he worked with Moses out in the fields, and George was sickly, so he stayed in the house with Susan, and she taught him how to read, taught him how to cook, taught him how to sew, taught him how to iron, taught him how to crochet. All these little tasks that later in life would become invaluable to him. When he was free time, he would go into the woods and he'd collect little weeds, and he'd build his own little garden. And he says sometimes many tears he would shed when he'd break the roots of one of his pets. He called his little plants pet. But he developed a green thumb. And so much that the other farmers, when they had plants that were sick, they'd either bring them to little George, or have George come and look at their farm, and he'd tell them, well, you need to do this or that. And he became known as a little plant doctor. Well, when he was 11 years old, he went into town in Neosho with Moses to pick up supplies, and he noticed a bunch of African-American children lined up in front of a house, and he goes, what's that? And he says, oh, that's a school for Negro children. And he says, I want to go there. So he goes back home, and they pray about it, and they've always encouraged him to learn, and so she cooks him a bunch of loaves of bread, and he goes into town, into Neosho, and goes to the school there. And the first night, he sleeps in a loft of a barn, and the next day he's taken in by Aunt Mariah and Uncle Andy Watkins, who were a childless black couple. She gave him his first Bible, which he cherished and carried with him always. And George would go around town and do odd jobs for people to raise money to pay for his grade school education. Now, can you imagine that? How many of you have children? I mean, can you imagine an 11-year-old child, orphan, going around town, knocking on doors, to earn money to pay for his grade school? Well, 2.5 years, he learns all that Schoolmaster Foster can teach him. So he hitches a ride with the family going to Fort Scott, Kansas. He lives in a lean-to behind a stagecoach depot. And then he cooks for a wealthy family in town, and they let him live underneath their back porch. And then he earns money to go pay for his high school education. And he witnessed a lynching there, and he fled. I mean, so he experienced that terrible prejudice in his own life. And I left that in the book as well. And so then he fled to another town, Paola in Olathe, Kansas, and he would open up a little laundry, or he would do odd jobs, and he became this industrious, and finally graduated from high school and went to apply to Highland College, and he got accepted to college. So he goes back to Neosho, and he shows his acceptance letter to college. Here he's so proud of himself, started with nothing and went out on the road, and now he's accepted to college, and goes to, shows everybody, and then when it's fall, it's time to go to college, he shows up at the university, and the president looks up from the desk and says, oh, I'm sorry, there's been a mistake. They don't let him in because of his race. Terrible. Anyway, dejected, he goes to western Kansas, and he homesteads, which was a valuable experience for him because he learns what a farmer has to go through. And little did he know that later on he'd be the answer to prayer to lots of farmers. And so while he's in western Kansas, the people there love him. He plays his accordion at their dances, and he sings. He had a beautiful voice, and he paints. And they fell in love, and so his correspondence with him the rest of his life with the people in western Kansas was so special. Then he went to Kansas City, and he went to a business school to learn typewriting and telegraph, the ... and he worked for the Union Telegraph Company. I mean, talk about industrious. Then he goes to Winterset, Iowa, and becomes the head cook at a hotel. And while he was there, he writes about meeting some people. And let me just read this story to you. Matter of fact, if I can indulge you, I want to go back just a hair and give you a story of how Carver became a Christian. And this book is a collection of his letters that he wrote throughout his life. So you get to read his writings. It's not me telling you, it's his. This was a letter in July 24th, 1931 to Miss Isabel Coleman of Greensboro, North Carolina. And she asked how he became a Christian. And he said, "I was just a mere boy when converted, hardly 10 years old. There isn't much to the story. God just came into my heart one afternoon while I was alone in the loft of our big barn while I was shelling corn to be carried to the mill to be ground into flour. A dear little white boy, one of our neighbors about my age, came by one Saturday morning, and in talking and playing, he told me he was going to Sunday school tomorrow morning. I was eager to know what a Sunday school was. He said they sang hymns and prayed. I asked him what prayer was and what they said. I do not remember what he said, only remember that as soon as he left, I climbed into the loft of my barn, knelt down by the barrel of corn, and prayed as best I could. I do not remember what I said. I only recall that I felt so good that I prayed several times before I quit." Isn't that precious? And he goes on to say, "My favorite song is, 'Must Jesus Bear the Cross Alone and All the World Go Free?'" Anyway, when he is a young man and he's in Winterset, Iowa, he writes how he visited a church. And let me just find this story for you here. He says, "One evening, I went to a white church and sat in the rear of the house, and the next day a handsome man called for me at the hotel and said his wife wanted to see me. When I reached the splendid residence, I was astonished to recognize her as the prima donna in the choir. I was most astonished when she told me that my fine voice had attracted her." And Carver had it was a high voice, but it was very beautiful because he sang, he even studied singing in school. So she had me sing quite a number of songs for her and made me agree to come by her house at least once a week. And from that time till now, Mr. and Mrs. Milholland have been my warmest and most helpful friends. I cooked at this hotel for some time, then opened a laundry for myself. I ran the laundry for 1 year. This same Mr. and Mrs. Milholland encouraged me to go to college. It was her custom to have me come by at the day and rehearse the doings of the day. She would invariably laugh at such a recital and said, "Whosoever heard of any one person doing half so many things?" She encouraged me to sing and paint, for which arts I had a passionate fondness. In 1 year, I had saved enough money to take me to Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa, where I took art and music and college work. I opened a laundry here for my support. After all my matriculation fees had been paid, I had 10 cents worth of cornmeal and 5 cents worth of beef suet. I lived on these two things for a whole week. It took that long for people to learn that I wanted clothes to wash. After that week, I had many friends and plenty of work. I would never allow anyone to give me money. No difference how badly I needed it. I wanted literally to earn my living. Imagine that. He says, I remained here for 3 years, and his art teacher was Miss Etta Budd. Now this lady right down here was his art teacher, Miss Etta Budd, and he writes about how she was always an encourager to him. And this is him painting at Simpson College. That's him, and here's this chair, and there's the easel that he's painting on. And his paintings were so good that one of his paintings, the yucca plant, which was the plant he saw when he was in western Kansas. Remember, he didn't want to go out there first, but he went out there. He saw this western Kansas. This plant went to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 and got an honorable mention. Now, I don't know about you, but it'd be pretty nice to have a painting of mine, go to the World's Fair and you recognized. Carver had a tremendous artistic gift. Well, Miss Etta Budd noticed how well he painted the plants, and she said, you must really like plants. And he goes, well, yeah, I do. And she said, you could help more people in agriculture than you can through painting. Why don't you go to Iowa State College of Agriculture, where my dad teaches? If there's any teachers out there, the power you have to steer that young mind or of that young woman or that young man is immense. Well, she encouraged him. He went ahead to Iowa State College of Agriculture. He shows up at the campus, and he said, being a colored boy and the crowded condition of the school made it rather embarrassing for some and made the question of a room for me rather puzzling. Professor Wilson, who was the head of the agricultural department, as soon as he heard it, he said, "Send him to me. I have a room." And he gave me his office and was very happy in doing so. Your Carver lived in the office of the head of the agricultural department. He goes on to write this: "Wilson, the Honorable James Wilson, is sacred to me. He was one of the finest teachers that it was ever my privilege to listen to. He taught a Sunday school class in which every student would have enrolled if they had been allowed. The class grew so large that he conceived of a very unique plan to divide it and graduated some 25 of us who had been with him the longest. I happened to be one of those graduated. We all left him sad and reluctantly and gave him to understand in no uncertain terms that we did not like it at all, but out of our love for him we went. But in less than 2 months we were all back again. Our displeasure grieved him very much, and he said to me many times that he would never try to divide the class again, no matter how large it got." Well, Carver had James Wilson as one of his professors, and let me see if I can find James Wilson. James Wilson, the guy that gave him his office to live in, he went on to become the United States Secretary of Agriculture. So Carver had another professor, Henry C. Wallace. Henry C. Wallace. He goes on to become United States Secretary of Agriculture. And then Henry A. Wallace's son is a student at Iowa State. Carver graduates from college. He's the first black graduate in the entire state of Iowa. Carver then gets his master's degree. Carver then gets offered an assistant botanist position at the college. He is so brilliant, they give him a position on staff. He's in charge of the laboratories, in charge of the greenhouses. And then Henry C. Wallace's son becomes a student underneath the Carver. So Henry C. Wallace grows up and becomes U.S. Secretary of Agriculture and Vice President for FDR. This guy, Vice President for FDR, was George Washington Carver's student. So George Washington Carver was rubbing shoulders with the top people in the country. And this is some of the other stuff. He was in the ROTC there on campus, and these are the different clubs that he was a part of. That's him there. And he was the top of his class and so responsible and always on time. And anyway, so again, he's rubbing shoulders with the top people in the country in the agricultural field, and then he gets a letter. And the letter was from Booker T. Washington. And this is what the letter said. 1896. Tuskegee Institute seeks to provide an education, a means of survival for those that attend. Our students are poor, often starving. They travel miles of torn roads and across years of poverty. We teach them to read and write, but words cannot fill stomachs. They need to learn how to plant and harvest crops. Listen to this. I cannot offer you money, position, or fame. The first two you have, the last from the place you now occupy, you will no doubt achieve. These things I now ask you to give up. And in their place, I offer you work. Hard work. But the knowledge that you will bring a people from degradation, poverty, and waste into full manhood. Signed, Booker T. Washington. Carver writes back, May 16th, 1896. My dear sir, I'm just in receipt of your letter of the 13th and hasten to reply. I'm looking forward to a very busy, pleasant, and profitable time at your college, and shall be glad to cooperate with you in doing all I can through Christ who strengtheneth me to better the condition of our people. Ladies and gentlemen, that's one aspect of Carver that is overlooked in today. He said, through Christ who strengtheneth me to better the condition of our people. He was a Christian. Well, I wanted to read a couple other quotes for you before we move on. When he was at Simpson College, the art college, this is a letter he wrote to the Milhollands. He said, I'm glad the outlook for the upbuilding of the kingdom of Christ is so good. We are having a great revival here. 40 seeking last night, 25 arose for prayer at the close of the service. He says, shall be glad to hear from you soon, George Carver. He was going to a church where they had altar calls. And this is what he wrote from Iowa State when he first got there. He says, Dear Mr. and Mrs. Milholland, I as yet do not like it here as well as I did at Simpson because the helpful means for a Christian growth is not as good. But the Lord helping me, I will do the best I can. I'm glad to hear that the work for Christ is progressing. Oh, how I wish people would awake from their lethargy and come out soul and body for Christ. On and on he talks about his faith. Well, he goes down to Tuskegee. And when he's down there, he finds that there is no agricultural department. By the way, when he leaves, they pitch in and the staff at Iowa State buy him a microscope. Now, this was a very expensive, top-of-the-line instrument. I mean, that would be like, you know, at your job, they buy you the top-of-the-line computer before you leave. They buy him this microscope. Well, he gets down to Tuskegee, and there's no department, so he sends his students out to the junkyard, to the trash can, to get broken bottles. And he'll take a broken bottle and turn it upside down and make a funnel out of it. And old pieces of tubes and old pans, and he creates his laboratory out of this junk. And then he teaches his students, and they go out to the farmers around there. And what he discovers is that the farmers have been growing cotton year after year after year. And the cotton depletes the soil. It sucks the nutrients out. So every year you grow it, you get less. And so not only were they bad enough, but the boll weevil comes through, a little bitty bug that gets inside the cotton and eats what's left. So these farmers were devastated. So Carver, who knows agriculture, who experienced farming, he says, okay, you need to rotate crops and do irrigation and do fertilization and all this type of stuff. And then he says you plant legumes, which were peanuts, sweet potatoes, and soybeans. Because they're root-type plants, and there's little fungus that grows on the roots that puts nitrogen back into the soil. And fertilizer is basically just nitrogen. And so it fertilized the soil. And so the farmers started growing peanuts, and they were only using it really for horse feed, you know, alfalfa or something. And so they started growing more and more peanuts, and they had more peanuts than the market wanted. And so Carver went into his laboratory and asked God to give him ideas on what the peanut can be used for, and he created over 300 uses for the peanut. He literally created a $500 million industry. He created it. Now listen to some of the stuff. 32 different kinds of milk, dehydrated milk, buttermilk, peanut butter, salted peanuts, peanut flour, butter from peanut milk, cream cheese, mock beef, mock chicken. You know, we talk about soy burgers. You know, well, that hamburger joint doesn't have real hamburgers, they're soy burgers. Carver's the one that learned how to take a soybean and turn it into the texture and flavor of meat. He called it mock beef and mock chicken. Chili sauce, chop suey, Worcestershire sauce, vinegar, molasses, oleo, margarine, mayonnaise, salad oil, cooking oil, peanut brittle, peanut butter, chocolate, popcorn, peanut kisses, oh, that sounds good, castor oil, quinine, rubbing oil, laxative, cold cream, shaving cream, baby massage, face cream, oil for hair, scalp, shampoo, face powder, talcum powder, antiseptic soap, glycerin, ointment, animal feed and farming, hog feed, stock feed, fertilizer, leather stains from mahogany to blue, wood stains, paint, shoe polish, leather polish, metal polish, writer's ink, printer's ink, dyes for cloth, non-toxic pigments from which crayons were eventually created. You know, how many of you had a kid eat a crayon and they don't die? You know? Well, you know, they eat lead-based paint, they die. But back then, most of the colors had like a lead base. They were dangerous to eat. Well, he created non-toxic colors. Adhesives, alcohol, paper, rope, cordage, synthetic cotton, synthetic silk, plastics, rubber, lubricating oil, axle grease, laundry soap, washing powder, cleaning, wall boards from the peanut hulls, carpet, linoleum, wood filler, synthetic marble, highway paving material, creosote, glue, nitroglycerin. How can you make face cream and nitroglycerin out of the same stuff? I'll never figure out. Anyway, gasoline, diesel fuel, oil, charcoal briquettes. All of this stuff. Well, he spoke before the YMCA. He was speaking he actually had a Bible study that he was leading at Tuskegee. And it's in the book, I won't read it, but he says, years ago I went into my laboratory. This is what he said in 1920 at the Young Men's Christian Association in Blue Ridge, North Carolina. Years ago I went into my laboratory and said, "Dear Mr. Creator, can you tell me what the universe was made for?" The great Creator answered, "You want to know too much for that little mind of yours. Ask for something more your size, little man." Then I said, "Mr. Creator, can you tell me what man was made for?" Again, the great Creator replied, "You're still asking too much. Cut down on the extent and improve on the intent." So I asked, "Please, Mr. Creator, can you tell me what the peanut was made for?" "That's better, but even that's infinite." "What do you want to know about the peanut?" "Mr. Creator, can I make milk out of the peanut?" "What kind of milk do you want to make? Good Jersey milk or just plain boarding house milk?" "Good Jersey milk." Then the great Creator taught me to take apart the peanut and put it back together again, and out of that process has come forth all these products. And then he goes on to say that 3.5 ounces of peanuts produce 1 pint of rich milk. Then in 1924, the peanut industry grows. Over 5 million acres are growing peanuts now. The farmers form a United Peanut Growers Association. And they asked Carver to go to Washington, D.C. to lobby Congress on a tariff on imported peanuts because they were bringing them in from China cheaper than we could grow them here. So here's Carver, goes to Washington, D.C. He only had one suit, and it looked pretty old, and he would put a brand new flower in the lapel every day. Well, anyway, he goes to the door of the Capitol, and the doorman wouldn't let him in. Again, some of the prejudice. Well, they're waiting in there, he doesn't show up, and it's like 10 minutes before the end of the day, and the congressman finally finds out he's waiting, goes there and apologizes, brings him in, has him before the people, and says, well, I'm sorry, you only got 10 minutes. Now, how would you feel if you got all prepared, you travel from Alabama to D.C., and they tell you only got 10 minutes because some doorman wouldn't let you in? I mean, that would be an opportunity to get upset, you know? But Carver, calm and peaceful, stands before them, and these are pictures I'm flashing up the screen of students there at Tuskegee, and he goes out to the farmers in the fields, and these are the cotton. And I apologize, those that are listening by radio don't know what's on the screen here, but I'm flipping through to find one picture. But here's the cotton crops, shows how they depleted the soil. I mean, this is the cotton at the docks. Look at that, tons and tons of cotton. You know, it made me feel terrible for all those slaves that had to pick all that for all those years. Anyway, here's Carver, and on the table in front of him are all these bottles of all these different things that he created, and he's holding up the different ones. And so he's standing before the congressman in the U.S. House Ways and Means Committee, January 21st, 1921, and he begins by quoting a scripture. He says, if you go to the first chapter of Genesis, we can interpret very clearly, I think, what God intended when he said, behold, I've given you every herb that bears seed, to you it shall be meat. And he says, this is what I believe, that it literally shall be meat. Everything is there to strengthen and nourish the body and keep it healthy. And he pulls out all these different things. And at the end of it, an hour and 45, after 10 minutes, the guy says, your time is unlimited. And so he talks for an hour and 45 minutes. And when he's done, the congressman said, Dr. Carver, how'd you learn all these things? He said, from an old book. What old book? Asked Carver. He said, the Bible. He says, does the Bible tell about peanuts? No, sir, Carver said. It tells about the God who made the peanut. I asked him to show me what to do with the peanut, and he did. Isn't that precious? Well, Carver was asked to speak in New York City at the New York's Marble Collegiate Church, 500 women of the Board of Domestic Missions, and he gets there and he says, God is going to reveal things to us he never revealed before if we put our hands in his. No books ever go into my laboratory. The thing I am to do and the way of doing it are revealed to me. I never have to grope for methods. He says, the moment I'm inspired to create something, I have the method. He says, without God to draw aside the curtain, I would be helpless. Sounds nice, right? The New York Times had somebody in the audience. The next day, they run an article condemning Carver, saying real men of science never talk that way. They make fun of him, they make fun of his race, they make fun of his religion. In the New York Times. How many of you have had media say bad things about you? Anyway, Carver writes back November 24th, 1924, to the editor of the New York Times. My dear sir, I have read with much interest your editorial pertaining to myself in the same issue of November 20th. I regret exceedingly that such gross misunderstandings should arise by what was meant by divine inspiration. It is never at a variance with information. In fact, the more information one has, the greater will be the inspiration. Paul, the great scholar, said in 2 Timothy 2:15, study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not be ashamed. And again, Paul said in Galatians, for I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it by him, but it was by revelation of Jesus Christ. He says, many other scriptures I could give, but these two are sufficient to cluster my remarks around. He says, I am a graduate of Iowa State College of Agriculture and Mechanical Arts in Ames, Iowa. I have 2 degrees in scientific agriculture. I did work at Simpson College, Indianola. And then he lists dozens of these scientists that he studied under and read their materials. I mean, Madame Curie, the lady that developed radiology. And he just on and on and on. Then he finally says, in your beautiful city of New York, I was struck by the large number of taros and yautas, which are roots, in your marketplace. They are edible roots imported from Trinidad, Puerto Rico, China, Dutch Guyana. As soon as I saw these roots, I marveled at the wonderful possibilities for their expansion. Dozens of things came to mind while I looked at them. I would follow the similar plan that I pursued in developing products from the white potato. I know of no one who has ever worked with these roots in this way. I know of no book from which I can get this information, yet I will have no problem in doing it. If this is not inspiration from a source greater than myself, or greater than anyone who has wrought up to the present time, kindly tell me what it is. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. So Carver becomes the buzz, and the New York Times has other people writing editorials, and they're writing back and forth and back and forth. And this becomes a tremendous thing all across the country. And this is a letter that Carver got from somebody, and he writes back, "Many thanks for your letter." He says, "How it lifted my soul and made me feel that, and after all, God moves in mysterious ways." He says, "I did indeed feel badly for a while, not that the cynical criticism was directed at me, but rather at the religion of Jesus Christ. Dear brother, I know that my Redeemer liveth. I believe through the providence of the Almighty that it was a good thing. Since the criticism was made, I have had dozens of books, papers, periodicals, magazines, personal letters from individuals in all walks of life. Copies of letters from the editor of the Times are bearing me out in that assertion." He gets all these letters, and I'm going to find this one picture here where there's Carver in front of a stack of letters. Now, for those that are listening, there's like a 3-foot-high stack of letters that Carver's sitting next to. He was getting letters from Mahatma Gandhi over in India, and Joseph Stalin inviting him to Russia. He was being visited at Tuskegee by Calvin Coolidge and FDR. He was getting job offers from Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulb and the phonograph, saying, "Come to Menlo Park, I'll give you all your equipment." He got job offers from Henry Ford, because Carver could take a milkweed and turn it into rubber, and Ford was looking for a new source of rubber for his automobiles. A 6-figure income if he would leave Tuskegee. He said, no, I'm called here. Carver had 2 U.S. postage stamps with his image on it, schools named after him, a 50-cent piece coin with his image and Booker T. Washington's image on it, and he had a nuclear submarine named after him in 1960 called the USS George Washington Carver, and the motto is "Strength through Knowledge." This is a man who has impacted the world in a powerful, powerful way. The last 10 years of his life, and I'm winding up here, he spent praying for people. Now, he had developed phenol, which was an oil made out of peanuts, for massaging. And back then, a lot of people had polio and atrophied limbs. You know, FDR had contracted it, you know. And so he would massage these limbs and help them to get the use of their limbs back. Now, as time goes on, scientists realize that the oil didn't have that much to do with it. It just kept them from being rubbed raw. But Carver literally pioneered the field of physical therapy, where you could work a limb and get... Anyway, this is what he wrote in 1934. He says, "I have patients who come to me on crutches who are now walking 6 miles without tiring, without either a crutch or a cane. My last patient today was one of the sweetest 5-year-old boys who 3 months ago had to be carried into my room, being paralyzed from the waist down. When I finished the massage today, much to our astonishment, he dressed himself and stood and walked across the room without any support." And he says, "I said our patients because I feel that your prayers help make this possible. And it's truly marvelous what the Lord is doing." Another letter, he said that today I had somebody walk one man came 200 miles with his afflicted son. And another place he says, "I have now before me 3,000 letters from suffering humanity, besides the people who come to me every day. I often have to refuse to see anyone until I get a little rest. Your letters are a great inspiration." And then he says, "A Georgia pastor of a large church over in Georgia had just informed me that the whole congregation prayed for me last night." And this is what he wrote to a Tuskegee pastor. He says, "I thank you also for your sermon at Greenwood Baptist Church. And if we do not take Christ seriously in our everyday life, all is failure, because it is an everyday affair. If we can just understand that the golden rule way of living is the only correct method and the only Christ-like method, this will settle all our difficulties that bother us." And then finally, I'm going to end with a letter that he wrote to James Harwick in 1928. He said, "As a small boy, exploring the almost virgin woods of the old Carver place, I had the impression that someone had been there just ahead of me. Things were so orderly, so clean, so harmoniously beautiful. A few years later in the same woods, I was to understand the meaning of this boyish impression because I was practically overwhelmed by some great presence. Not only had someone been there, someone was there. Years later, when I read the scripture, "In him we live and move and have our being," I knew what the writer meant. Never since have I been without the consciousness of the Creator speaking to me. Man, who needed a purpose, a mission to keep him alive, had one. He could be God's co-worker. My attitude toward life was my attitude toward science. Jesus said one must be born again, must become as a little child. He must let no laziness, no fear, no stubbornness keep him from that duty. If he were born again, he would see life from such a plane that he would have the energy not to be impeded in his life. He said, my purpose alone must be God's purpose, to increase the welfare and happiness of his people. Nature will not permit a vacuum. It will be filled with something. Human need is really a great spiritual vacuum which God seeks to fill. With one hand in the hand of a fellow man and the other in the hand of Christ, he could get across that vacuum, and I became an agent. Then the passage, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthened me," came to have real meaning. As I worked on projects which fulfilled the real human need, forces were working through me which amazed me. I would often go to sleep at night with an apparently insoluble problem. When I awoke, the answer was there. Why then should we who believe in Christ be so surprised at what God can do with a willing man in a laboratory? Some things must be baffling to the critic who has never been born again. I ask you to bow your heads with me as we close. Heavenly Father, I consider it an honor to speak before this esteemed audience today and to speak over the radio to the thousands that are listening. And I believe it's not by coincidence. And Lord, I do believe in my heart that this is a timely message. The black men and women that have made contributions to our society need to be exalted and lifted up as men and women of courage in the face of opposition, and they are an inspiration to every color of mankind. And as we work on projects which will fill a real human need, that forces will work through us. It's a force of the Holy Spirit. Lord, I ask right now that your eyes go to and fro across this room. Young men, young boys, young girls, young women, you can do what George Washington Carver did. You can start with nothing and impact the world. To those of us that are older, no matter what age we're at, God loves to use the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. He brings the mighty down and he exalts the humble. Lord, I pray right now, if there's anybody within the sound of my voice that has never given their life to Jesus, Jesus who's the answer to the race problem, Jesus who's the healer of the hearts, Jesus is the one who has unlimited potential, can free us of slavery, of bondage to sin. Jesus, I ask that you stand at the door and knock on the heart. If you're in here today and you may have never heard of me or may never hear from me again, it's not a coincidence that you're here. We're all just humble vessels of clay, and God chooses what color our skin would be, but someday we're going to stand before Him. And in the brilliance of His presence, all that's going to matter is if we've put our faith in the cross of Christ, in Jesus who paid for our sins, who suffered on the cross. He's forgiven us so that we can be used by Him. And I just ask you to pray this prayer under your breath, wherever you're at. Just close your eyes. It's nothing magic, but it's a beginning. And just say this prayer out in your heart or whisper it. Dear Jesus, forgive me of my sins. Have mercy on me. I'm a sinner. And I ask you, come into my heart. Give me a new life. I know that you love me, that you have planned good things for me. I trust you, Jesus, that you died in my place so I don't have to. And you rose from the dead, and I'm risen with you. And though my mind doesn't understand everything, I trust you with my heart. And I trust in the days ahead you'll make it clear to me. Make me a new person. Let today be a day of healing and new beginning in my life. And let it be a new beginning in our country.